Okay, this is the audio review, citing sources and preparing bibliographies. Okay, so citations, they're an essential part of your paper and they guard against plagiarism, right? So citations enhance credibility and persuasiveness. They're incredibly helpful as they're the shoulders that your paper stands on to help support your arguments. Without citations, we're just stating a bunch of opinions, and we're not situating our research within the context of what has come before it. It's essential to properly cite all the information that we include in our paper and to source all the facts or the factual statements that we make to give us that credibility, to support what we're ultimately arguing. Without citations, you can argue just about anything, all emotion-based, instead of related to peer-reviewed data, which is how you end up with people like Ben Shapiro, who cherry-pick data or use no data at all to make their incoherent gotcha arguments, if you can call them arguments. In his case, he's often saying the wage gap between men and women doesn't exist, or the wage gap between whites and people of color doesn't exist. But his argument isn't situated in research. The overwhelmingly supports the realities of these wage gaps. It's in his ideological wheelhouse to say, no, not real. Then with words, do what magicians do, make you look at one hand while the other one's fooling you. So don't be like Ben. Make sure you actually inquire into your topic, that you actually explore the literature that's out there so you become knowledgeable and credible about your topic. So plagiarism is important, right? You definitely want to guard against it in every way in your paper because plagiarism is an academic offense. You can get disciplined, you can fail a course, or even get kicked out of college over plagiarism. I've had to fail people for this class because of plagiarism because they plagiarized their main paper, which is like 80% of what we do in this class is write one long-ass paper. So maybe write it yourself, right? That's kind of the whole point of the class, So again, some people get kicked out of college for these things. It stays on your transcript. So it makes it really difficult to ever get back into school because your transcript says cheater on it, right? So it's important to not intentionally plagiarize. And it's also important to be careful and thoughtful about your citations so that you're not accidentally plagiarizing from any sources. Okay, so before I move on, I just want to quickly state the fact that you can plagiarize yourself. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're deciding, okay, for the paper in this class, I'm just going to recycle some crap I wrote from my psych class last year, or whatever it might be. So when I run that through software, when I'm grading your drafts, it's going to come up that it's already a paper that's been submitted for another course, right? And so even if you wrote that paper, it's still plagiarism, right? Because you're not creating an original document for the class. So that's a fun fact that a lot of students have no idea, is that you can plagiarize yourself. Okay, so anyway, moving on. Plagiarism is a theft of intellectual property. So as someone, or often many researchers, worked really hard to produce that information or develop those concepts and theories, so we should always give credit where credit is due. Sometimes plagiarism is just the result of, again, intentionally cheating, which is very serious, and defeats the entire point of going to college, right? Learning how to speak for yourself and make your own arguments. That's an essential skill. Right? Being able to use existing information to help support your points is another essential skill for adults. And again, if you're caught plagiarizing in this way, you're going to face consequences. Other times, plagiarism is the result of lazy or sloppy or improper citations. I think this is more often the case than the on-purpose kind. It's the result of not spending enough time working on the citations or not carefully including the sources when using their ideas. So you must cite information borrowed, whether quoting or paraphrasing their words. It's not just quotes that need citations. It's theories, arguments, or specific statistics or other findings that come from previous research. You wouldn't want someone to steal your ideas and pretend they were their own, right? So don't do that to the researchers who came before you, and just simply give credit where credit's due. Okay, so identifying your borrowed words and ideas. When it comes to using other people's words and ideas, there's 3 options of how to do it. You can quote or paraphrase. You can use the name of the source in your paper, or simply use a parenthetical citation, which is what you see at like the end of the sentence, right? I have a preference on what I want to see in your paper, but all 3 are technically acceptable, right? Though you should avoid using quotes to support all of your arguments, as it gives away your voice, and it makes it sound like you're not able to paraphrase what the sources are saying, which of course does not lend much credibility to your drafts. So quoting directly, we'll go over in the next slide the criteria for when you should use a direct quote, but what's important to know immediately is that you have to format the citations differently, your in-text citations in ASA citation style, when you use direct quotes. So for quotes, this means adding a page number to the in-text parenthetical citation. So I'm going to show you some examples of that later in this lecture so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so moving on to when to use quotations. When language is especially vivid or expressive. When exact wording is needed for technical accuracy. When the words of authority lend weight to an argument, right? Like let's say you were doing an article. I actually had a student previously, talking about Donald Trump's rhetoric and, kind of comparing the rise in certain, hate crimes to the specific rhetoric. So it would make sense in that situation to use the direct quotes from Trump to support what you're saying, right? So that would make more sense than paraphrasing in most cases. So again, remember these criteria are pretty specific, right? So another one is when it's important for debaters of an issue to explain the position in their own words, or when the language of the source is the topic of discussion, right? So if these conditions are not met, paraphrase, right? It's the best to paraphrase. Since you don't have to worry about the quote not fitting the scope of your paper or not making sense or slowing down the flow of the paper, it's almost always best to just put it in your own words. Explain it simply, succinctly, how it fits the scope of what you're looking at. Okay, so let's give some examples of paraphrasing and kind of get into this a little bit. So to paraphrase is to condense the author's meaning and articulate it in your own words. This is an important skill to develop in college that you will use for the rest of your life as you try to communicate to others the main points of a particular thing. So even in a non-academic context, you'll paraphrase for people, right? So for example, at my library job, I order teen books, right? And I read a whole bunch of young adult titles. And then people ask me about them. But I don't go grab the book and then just start reading it directly to them, right? If they ask me about the book, I talk about it instead, in my own words, relating the main points. Such as if someone asked me, hey, would I like the book Ready Player One? I'd first inquire if they're a nerd or a fan or nostalgic for the 80s and early 90s. If not, they might not like it, at least not as much as a real nerd. But if someone asked me to explain the book to them, I don't just regurgitate the book jacket that I've memorized or, turn to a page and give them a long quote. I give them a brief idea of the gist of the paper, or of the book in my own words, right? So let's apply this back to an academic context. I want to use this example so we can go through this in the next slide as to what works and what doesn't. And this is all from the book, right? So, okay, I'm going to read you this long-ass quote, and the idea is, let's say you want to use this for your paper, that you think this particular section fits the scope of your paper, and you want to somehow adapt this into something you can paraphrase in your paper. This is a long, wordy quote. You wouldn't want to just pop it in your paper because it's just going to really take away from the flow. So let me read it really quick, and then we'll get to the kind of what the essence of it is in the next slide. Okay, so the term suicide is applied to all cases of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative act of the victim himself, which he knows will produce this result. This definition excludes from our study everything related to the suicide of animals. Our knowledge of animal intelligence does not really allow us to attribute to them an understanding anticipatory of their death, nor, especially, of the means to accomplish it. If some dogs refuse to take food on losing their masters, it is because the sadness into which they are thrown has automatically caused lack of hunger. Death has resulted, but without being foreseen. So the special characteristics of suicide as defined by us are lacking. So basically, what's the easiest way to paraphrase that? Think about it for a second. I'll give you a second. If you were just describing this long-ass quote to a friend, what would you say? Right? Think about it. In my case, I'd say, animals can't commit suicide. Right? That's basically the gist, right? So again, let's go to the next slide, and I want to go over some of the samples of how to best paraphrase. But again, also, go over what doesn't work, right? Okay, so poor paraphrasing up here on top. When some pets stop eating because their owners have left, this is caused by the unhappiness into which they have fallen, which necessarily makes them lose their appetite. The final end that ensues, however, was not anticipated. Therefore, the unique features of suicide as described by our definition are missing. Now, what is wrong with that paraphrasing? Well, first, it just doesn't really make sense. It's super wordy, it's super confusing, and if you go back to the example here, it's basically like you just took the exact same thing, each point, and just kind of changed the words around a little bit, right? So it's not really paraphrasing. That's why it's poor, because you're basically just still copying what they're saying without really expressing it in your own words, right? Okay, another poor example of paraphrasing. Lost masters caused their sad dogs, refusing food, to lack hunger. The dogs died, not foreseeing this result. What is lacking is our special characterization of suicide as we define it. So again, it's looking at this quote and so specifically trying to pull almost like quotes out of this, right? So you see, if some dogs refuse to take food on losing their masters, it's because the sadness into which they are thrown has automatically caused lack of hunger. Death has resulted, but without being foreseen. And so they interpret that as, refusing food to lack hunger, dogs died, not foreseeing this result. So again, they're changing the context of what the author's actually arguing. It's a poor job because that's not really what Durkheim's saying, right? He's not really focusing that much on the starvation of a dog. He's basically just trying to say if a dog dies from starving itself, it's not suicide, right? That's really what he's trying to say. So let's look at the good example. According to Durkheim, right? So that's a great example already because it has the attribution going on there. Animals, such as abandoned dogs who starve themselves, do not commit suicide because they do not understand the connection between death and the means of causing death, right? So they don't understand that by not eating food, they will die, right? So that is so much closer to what Durkheim's actually saying in that long-ass stuffy quote, right? What's wrong with the top one? It's basically trying to take the exact same structure as the quote, but then you just it's almost like they went up to here and just clicked on these words and then were like synonym, just to change some of the specific wording, but it's basically still stealing it directly from the source without really putting it in your own words. This is like word salad, right? It does come from that article, but it doesn't make sense. And it's really like, what the hell are you trying to say? And I feel like this happens a lot in a lot of research papers because we're focusing so much on the article itself and trying to pull that specific information. Instead, sometimes what you got to do is write down that specific information and then just kind of like sit up or sit back from that and think, how would I describe this to a friend, to a significant other, to a parent, to, anyone in your life? Like, how would you describe it? What you read, right? So something like, again, this longer quote, if you had to say, what is Durkheim arguing? Well, he's arguing that suicide is a situation where people know if they do a particular thing, it will result in death. So dogs can't commit suicide, even though we see them sometimes die of starvation or, refuse to eat, basically. It's because they're sad. That doesn't mean that they're killing themselves through suicide, right? So, but this whole the special characteristics of suicide defined by us are lacking, right? This whole thing of taking what is lacking is our special characterization of suicide as we define it. Think about this one. If this stands by itself in the paper, what special characterization? If I'm reading this in your paper, I'm like, what the hell does this mean? And I don't see the connection of this to that particular quote. So what you're supposed to be doing when you paraphrase is just explain it and contextualize their larger argument, right? So Durkheim was saying animals don't commit suicide because they don't understand the connection between death and the means of causing death. That's a great summation. It's clear, it's to the point, and it is still, accurate to what Durkheim's actually saying, right? So that's a big part of paraphrasing as well, is making sure that you're actually true to the argument of what the source is saying. Okay, let's move on to citations in the text. Okay, so There's different approaches. So let's say these are all from that same quote that we were talking about. So animals do not commit suicide. Durkheim, 1951, right? So that's, I know that's my preference, is I like you to be direct and just use parenthetical citations when possible, because oftentimes that's going to speed up the flow of your paper versus these other examples that are here. But again, these are all correct. It's just a matter of how you want to display them in your paper. It matters, connected to your voice as a writer. But again, I do encourage you to try to incorporate some of these examples that are much more succinct, like this one, because again, that will help you synthesize your argument down to kind of a clear focus and help the reader keep focus as they go through your paper, right? Another example here, suicide involves knowledge of the consequences. This definition excludes everything related to the suicide of animals. So you see they pull a direct quote, right? So they need the page number as well. So it's exactly the same as the other in-text parenthetical citation. And remember, for ASA format, it's not APA format, it's ASA format. APA would have a comma. ASA does not have a comma, right? Just year, or just author, year, right? And again, for page numbers, you're just going to do that colon, page number, right? Another example, according to Durkheim. So this, we'll talk about in a second, the running acknowledgement. So according to Durkheim, and then year and page number, animals do not commit suicide because committing suicide involves understanding the consequences. And then the last example, Durkheim, 1951, argues that suicide involves knowledge of the consequences. In his words, this definition excludes everything related to the suicide of animals. And you still see the page number because they're using the direct quote, right? So again, the first two examples over here rely on the citation at the end of the sentence to inform where the information is from, right? While the last two put some information in parenthetical citation, but they use a running acknowledgement. So running acknowledgement just tells you that all the information between the year and any sort of parenthetical citation is related to that source. So for example, in this one, you're looking at two different sentences, right? So when they say Durkheim, 1951, you know from right here until you see this, that all of this is the same information, right? Instead of having to be like Durkheim and then Durkheim and then Durkheim every single sentence, right? It saves you from those kind of repetitive citations, right? And then when you start the sentence with information about your source, you see, again, this is demonstrated here, right? Starting with the information by the source. Again, or if you start with your information and cite it with the source, either way is fine, right? It's not, there's no right or wrong. There's just sometimes one style tends to work more than another. And it is in some small part a preference thing of the person writing the paper. What I suggest for all of you is you just don't want the same exact style for every single citation, because that makes the paper repetitive or stale. And if there's going to be one format you use over and over and over and over, I would suggest it be this one because it is the most direct and succinct, right? But again, they are all correct ways to cite in-text information, right? Okay, moving on to just the ASA format itself, right? For the papers in this class, you have to use the ASA style from the ASA style guide. So I don't make you buy that because you can just find all that information online, and these things tend to change and those things get updated. So I have a link here. This is like an active link. You can click on for the Purdue OWL resources. See my little hand pops up. It'll show you, this one specifically links to the in-text citations, and then there's another link there for the post-text citations, right? The reference page at the end of your paper. Both of those things you need to know, right? But, in this class, I'm only concerned with the in-text and the post-text citations. You do not need to worry about the manuscript formatting or making an abstract or making a title page or any of that stuff. I just care that the information in the paper is cited in the in-text citations and that I can find the corresponding citation in the reference page. Okay, so in ASA format, the use of an author's name in the text is followed by the publication date in parentheses. So the material inside the parentheses refers to a source listed in the references at the end of the paper. So I should be able to see the reference made in your paper, flip to the back of your paper, and know where that information is coming from, right? So let's go through some more formatting examples. So again, both of these are correct. It's just, how they differ slightly. So the first one, Goffman disputes the notion that mentally ill patients are hospitalized primarily for treatment. Instead, he believes that they are institutionalized so that they can be controlled, right? So the first one alludes to a specific part of the manuscript, the Goffman source that it's citing, versus the other one is pulling a specific quote, right? Goffman claimed the goal of hospitalization is not to cure the patient, but to contain him in a niche in free society where he can be tolerated, right? So you see how if you're using the quote like that in the midst of your sentence, it's most often cited at the end, right? But again, these are both correct. So I just ask that if you use quotations at all, you cite it with the page number. I don't really expect to see the page number if you have just paraphrased instead, but I do expect the page number if you're using a direct quote. Okay, here's another set of, just kind of how this works. So if you don't name the author in the text, include the author's last name, year, and sometimes page number in parentheses at the end of the quoted thought. So that's the parenthetical citation, right? So another example here, the treatment of mentally ill in this country can give the impression that the goal of hospitalization, quote, is not to cure the patient, but to contain him in a niche in free society where he can be tolerated, right? So again, that way you're not doing that running acknowledgement, you're not, mentioning Goffman at the beginning of the sentence, but as long as you do at the end of the sentence, as long as it's clear to the reader where that information is coming from, then that's great. That way you don't have to specifically say Goffman said this and Goffman said that. You can make it much more tailored to your own research, and oftentimes it depends on your papers, obviously, but sometimes if we give too much weight to the sources, it kind of loses the scope of what we're arguing and what our voice is leading, right? So it's important to kind of, understand how these mechanisms work. Okay, so another thing is that when you first mention an author in the text, you should have a year attached, right? So Durkheim, 1951, claims suicide is not only an individual event, but also a social phenomenon, right? Like I said before, page numbers are needed for quotations. And this is an interesting one too. When citing several authors discussing a single idea, so this is something I really encourage. Let's say it's the beginning of your literature review, right? And your literature review is about, gender inequality, right? Something like that. Then a lot of your sources are making more generalized arguments that you can kind of connect them together on their more generalized argument, right? So you could say something like, a prevalent issue in American society is gender inequality. And then you can cite like 5 or 6 of those sources all at the same time that are all saying that, but they're saying it in different ways. And then later in the lit review itself, you start splitting those hairs. You kind of get more in depth, one way in which gender inequality manifests is through the wage gap. God, why am I talking about the wage gap a bunch today? Anyway, or one way in which, gender inequality manifests, right? These different concepts, then you can slice them differently and talk about how the articles explore those things differently. But oftentimes it's helpful, and it really does show that you understand the scope of the paper and the literature when you can group them together around the things that they're kind of more generally saying. So an example here, family researchers have discovered that within the first year of divorce, mothers and children undergo as much as 30% decrease in family income, whereas men experience up to a 10% increase. So they're basically sourcing at this moment these 3 different research studies, right? Beyonce, whatever, this one, Kulik, and Mantic and Bowman, right? Okay, so for something like this, what's important to do is when you have these 3 different articles is that you list them in alphabetical order, right? And so you see that they've done that here. The first one listed starts with a B, the second one starts with a K, and then the third one starts with an M. This can confuse students, so let me be as clear as possible. They need to be listed in alphabetical order as they are listed on the article itself. So this means you never change the order of the names in the articles. Like you wouldn't say, Bowman and Mantic, right? You'd say Mantic and Bowman because that's the way you found it on the article. right? So if the citation says Mantic and Bowman, there's reasons for that. It's assumed, well, that's mostly true, right? That the first name on a research report usually denotes the person who did the most work, right? Think of it like a group project. If you're like me, you end up doing a lot of the work, or sometimes almost all of the work in a group project by yourself, right? So those social loafers in your group aren't going to, negatively impact your grade, right? So in that case, your name would be first on the citation because you did more work. Ultimately, though, academia is also a sort of pissing contest, which is another reason why you do not change the name order. But you would, again, now that you have these 3 articles, you would list them in alphabetical order from the way they're listed in that article, right? So for example, like this one, the way that they're organized is this is from the article directly. I wouldn't move con in between because that would be alphabetical. Does that make sense? I just want to keep them as they are, but then when you're arranging them together, make sure you list them alphabetically. Or here's a fun one. This really only happens if you're like kind of a super nerd like me and you're really deep diving into a subject. What if you had more than one source from this person? Right? Like there's a Kulik, 2010 or something. Then you put them in numerical order as well. So it'd be like this one, Kulik 2005, another one in here, Kulik 2010, then Mantic and Bowman, right? So I want to make that as clear as possible. You're supposed to list them alphabetically by the first author, but you do not change the order of authors, right? So it's a lot of stuff to digest, especially if you're not used to citations and formatting and all this stuff. And I know it can be cumbersome and difficult, but this is why I wanted to have this resource for you so that when you're doing this now, you review this now, but then each time you're editing and if you're having any trouble with the formatting or the citations, you can refer back to this lecture as a reference or resource to help you kind of guide you towards the way you should be structuring these things inside of your paper.